in this budget, $200,000 is going to be budgeted in today in this restricted fund. You know, that's arbitrary. I'm just using that as an example. But that's just as important as identifying a bus that has to be paid. It's just as important as we have for sick leave and other things. It's a fundamental function of this operation financially.
Maybe a suggestion is you could have a resolution establishing this fund at any point, but then the final budget presumably would budget a certain amount to that restricted reserve fund. So the resolution could establish it, but then the text of the resolution could make reference that the fund will be determined by the final, the amount of the fund for 2016 will be determined by the final approved budget resolution.
Yeah. Sure. That you said in about 30 seconds what we've been talking about for about a half hour. Thanks.
Thanks, Mr. Norton has a...
Joe, you had mentioned that it can be a set amount or a percentage, right?
That's I was just reiterating what I heard the board say, but certainly.
And I mean, I would think a percentage would be the best because, I mean, it varies month to month. You could have a storm in the winter. You could, you know, with, for example, you know, with paying fares, there's going to be a drop off in ridership and that kind of thing. So I would think a percentage of what the revenue generates.
And that's why I suggested that this is probably something that the text of the resolution, drafting the resolution really doesn't take that long. But there's some thought needs to go into exactly that issue, and I would think that staff with the finance committee could take a look at that and make a recommendation to the board. But that's, I mean, that's a difficult issue, and as an attorney, I can't say which is right or wrong. Either can work.
I understand.
Yeah.
Okay. Any other questions before we allow Paul to move along and get through this?
Out of curiosity, is our monthly cost about $1 million? We keep throwing that around.
Monthly operating expense is probably around that 700,000 right now, 700,000 to 800,000.
That's what's shown on our cash flow statement. You know, 750,000, 800,000. You have to average the insurance payment over that.
And the other thing the board probably should consider, we're all elected officials. We have timelines on our tenure in our elected capacity, which reflects our time on this board. And if this board wants to accomplish these goals and stabilize this facility plan in our tenure, then I think it's incumbent upon us to act promptly on establishing the account, the restricted account, and the target amount and how we're going to get there. So if there are changes on the board, there's at least a map that says this is where the board wants to go with this facility to get us to a stabilized, financially stabilized condition. So time is of the essence.
Not to have all the money in there, because I could be out of year to year.
No, I know not to have all the money in there, but at least have the plan set up.
Okay, I just wanted to be realistic.
Yeah.
Okay. I mean, I could have a short shelf life.
So could I. I'm a lot older than you are.
So on
next slide.
On the point on putting together a resolution, I'm seeing that the tentative schedule, the board will take up budget review again on October 23rd. Is it the board's desire or the finance committee's desire to have a meeting with staff and the finance committee and council to discuss and maybe draft a resolution between now and the 23rd? Or is that too soon?
I think we can.
I would like to see that, but they're going to finance.
That's
All right.
doable.
Okay.
Yeah.
Paul, sorry, I should ask
Sure.
you first.
Make it happen.
That's what I like, action.
Okay. Moving on. So the first piece, as you saw, this was broken out into various sections. You had you have your operating revenues, expenses, capital revenues, and expenses, beginning reserves, ending reserves. So that first piece is your budgeted beginning reserves. And if you look at page 2.1, you can see that first section is beginning reserve balances. So it's showing it for 14, 15, and 16. Just beginning reserves.
Can you go back to that?
Sure.
Just give me a real update. When you have some in the very far right column there, you've got 139%, 139.0. When you come to those large percentage changes in there, could you just add a little comment on there?
Why
the big pop?
Well, I think it's because we've suddenly developed the idea of reserves, and now all of a sudden we put money in those reserves, and you go from 0 to any number, you're going to have a big jump. So percentages, for me, it's just a way to alert me to look at it a little more closely. And what we're seeing is a change in philosophy to hold money separately in the reserve, and there's going to be a big difference. We're seeing a big difference between 16 budget and 15 projected actuals. So you can see we went from 0 to those two numbers. It could have been $1, and we would have had 100%.
No, I appreciate the percentages, because I look at those too. Even going down my initial review of even the expense columns on there, there's some big percentage jumps in there. So when you come to those, could you just give kind of the quick narrative on why?
Why? Yeah.
So, Paul, here's a good example of where I think that we can clarify something on a chart, actually looking at this.
Okay.
So if we took general operating and took that out of the budgeted beginning reserves, and all we're talking about are actual restricted reserves or dedicated reserves, and then we refer to that general operating as kind of the cash on hand, like it's the starting point of the checking account, but it's not a restricted reserve amount. Because really, you know, I was trying to figure out, well, how we hadn't had these set up. How could we have any basis for a increase, right? Because the reality is that there aren't reserves. There's just fund balance carried over. And I think that that's part of what we're trying to distinguish is between that rotating cash that moves forward and that money that's held out and restricted for certain purposes.
But in this picture, the general operating is what you might be describing as rotating cash. The contingency line, that fifth one down, I was planning to rename to restricted general operating perhaps. So the reason why I like to keep them all on the same ledger, you might say, is so that you can watch how they change. You start with beginning balance, there's activity, whether it's operating or capital, and then you can see the end. And then within those middle sections, you'll see the transfers between those funds, and you can follow it. All the math would work out, the accounting would work out. So in a sense, it's a matter of kind of clarity and completeness, that nothing would be hidden, beginning, activity, ending. And so I'm happy to change the titles, and I think you're right, there is a difference between those ideas that maybe isn't as easy to see unless you really understand that the differences between those reserves. Some are more restricted in a sense because they're for a specific purpose.
Right.
They could become even more and more restricted if they require approval before any transfers. But this kind of lays out the template.
Okay.
So in looking at this, if we were to just add up those top three, and then take that away from the 2279, that would give us unencumbered kind of that.
Yeah, in a sense.
Yeah.
And it's shown there in the general operating under 2016 at 1.9 million.
Okay.
That's the target that the Finance Committee has been watching when we're talking about recovery and monies available. That has gone up since last year. You can see it was 953 at the end of 2015.
Projected,
yeah. And the year before it was 122.
Well, we're making progress.
So we could decide to take a portion of that and put in.
Absolutely.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that
see,
would be
this-
our start, right?
Yeah,
This is where my problem
Yeah.
comes in, because when John Q. Public looks at this, and they're looking at $1.967 million that we just got to blow on anything we want to. This isn't a mom and pop store. We shouldn't be carrying around almost $2 million in unaccounted for cash. In other words, if there's not something to be spending that on, it needs to be put.
It's, right now,
Or
it's the first attempt at the 3-month
Right.
reserve.
I know, but it's sitting there and
And it's not
sitting in there.
adequate for 3 months.
I know, but right now it's just sitting in the general checkbook.
Well, we need to give it a different name. and
That's what we need to do.
We already know.
I know, well, that's.
But not all of that is would move to
Exactly,
contingency,
yeah.
because some of that, and that's where this has been so confusing for a while, is some of that is already committed to be spent. And some of that is, cash flow operations. And so of that $1,967,000, I think part of what the board needs to know is how much of that could we safely move to restricted funds, and how much stays in that checkbook.
Sure.
Example, yeah, right, because we know that we've got some, have we moved all of our capital reserve up? Or we have capital reserve payout in that general operating?
What I was.
That's on another
Yeah.
section of the same report.
What I was going to say is that we're looking at beginning reserves, and we already know that our operating monthly reserve expenditures, let's say $800,000. So we know $800,000 of that 1.9 million is, we probably should keep in that general operating. And then we also know that a WISTA payment's $350,000, so we might want to add another $300,000-400,000 to that and make sure that our general operating doesn't go below that. Anything above and beyond that, yeah, you could probably move it into a restricted fund safely without handcuffing just the daily operations of the organization.
But is that year end, that their general operating year end for 2016, or that's the amount we're carrying forward?
This is beginning reserves, so it would be the beginning of 2016.
So my question there, though, is still, we've got a significant amount of money that we're going to pay out on the capital side for buses this year. Is that capital amount for buses still in that general operating line, or has it, because it's going to be more than $39,000?
Part of it is, I could say part of it is because we're going to be getting reimbursements for those capital items, and then we'll have to get a match. You could say, well, it's coming out of that general operating reserve, or you could say it's coming out of the surplus that's happening during that year. It would be coming from money unspent for other purposes, and it's detailed in that budget.
There's a simple answer to Jill's question. It's page 2.2.
Right, but it's not on this, but
It's not on this chart because that's just an example.
But that's just beginning, that's reserves.
That's just the first starting point of the page. But if you look at the middle of the page, capital expenses spells out all the things that can be paid for, including transfers to the reserves.
Right, but what makes me uncomfortable is to go to say, here's what our budgeted beginning reserves are, when some of those funds are known obligations. So they're not necessarily reserves. There's committed funds in there. And so I don't know, I'm not sure how to explain it, but that's not cash we have. There's some money in there that we've already promised away.
Well, you'll see, and we'll go through it, is in the separate sections, we're receiving money for those grants, and we're spending money for those grants. We're also putting money aside, sometimes at the same rate, sometimes at an accelerated rate, to pay for not only this year's capital expenditures, but the future. So there isn't a direct correlation between the reserve itself and the expenditure in that year. What we're doing is, like we detailed in the TDP, is we're setting aside what's required and perhaps more. And so those reserve balances will fluctuate, but they could be greater than the expense in any one year.
And I don't mean to correct you, Paul, but this is end of 2016, not the beginning point.
Now, this is the beginning
No,
reserve.
I'm looking at the page. It's the bottom, and the beginning is at the top.
Oh, right, you're right, okay.
Right, so this includes all the purchases.
Okay, that makes a difference in how I understand the sheet.
Yeah,
If
this is
it's-
the end of the year.
Okay,
Oh, okay, I'm sorry. The beginning of 2016, of course, would be the same as the end of 2015.
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah. It's,
no, that doesn't make much sense. So is the end of 20, is the, yeah, that didn't change.
it's on the
my
top
end.
of the page.
No, so what I was trying to determine is going into 2016, are we carrying forward 2 million, or is that what we predict to have at the end of 2016? And what you're saying by total beginning reserve balances, well, that could be, is that the beginning reserve balance for 2017?
No.
This slide would be the beginning of 16.
Right, and so, and what I've been trying to say
It's
is
not.
that,
That's the end of 16. Just look at page 2.2. I'm sorry.
I'm looking at 2.2.
The beginning numbers are at the top of the page. The ending numbers are at the bottom of the page.
Yes.
It's pretty clear on 2.2.
okay, I'm at 2.2.
The beginning for the year is budgeted to be 1.692,897.
Okay.
Actually, that's, yeah.
Okay, so here's my question. It says 2015 actual projected 1792. So is that the end of 2015, we're gonna have 1792, and coming into 2016, it's gonna be 1692, where we lose $100,000.
Well, actually, okay, look on the page that precedes this, 2.1. 2.1, we didn't lose any money. The you can explain it better than I can, Paul, but it has to do with,
I'm gonna give it a try. I hope we're all looking at the same document, but
Yeah.
column 3,
On 2.1.
on the 2.2, column 3 at the very bottom, showing my total annual reserve balance of 2.2 million, or 2,279,765. Does everyone see that?
yeah.
If I look at that number and then go up to the beginning of reserve for the next year, which would be on page 2.1, the fourth column, 2006, those are the same.
Going
So-
backwards a page.
So what it did is that you look at your ending reserve, and then it rolls to the beginning for the next year, and that's where the connection is made. And so this slide is just showing the first section on page 2.1, and that 2.279
Yeah.
is the beginning reserve for 2016, which is the same as the ending reserve for 2015. That was
Right.
kind of what I was throwing at.
So what I've been trying to explain is that some of that money though is already obligated. And so it's not, unless I'm not,
I think that's true.
yeah, right,
Yeah,
so it's
I think that's
obligated
true.
into 2016. So we have promises in here that are not checking account dollars. If there's money in there that we've said, we're gonna allocate this amount for budget, buses, this amount for radios, the expenses we know that are coming. And so part of what I think, although I understand that this is a summary sheet to show us what we're carrying forward, what I'm worried is a little misleading or confusing is that it appears that we're carrying forward this fund balance when in fact some of it's obligated. So it's not, they're not flexible dollars, there's committed dollars in there. And I can't tell from the summary sheet what we're really working with in terms of available cash that we could put in a contingency or make budgeting decisions with, or, because that doesn't easily summarize that for me.
Right, because out of that, out of that 2.279 million, we know right off the bat, you've got 300,000 going to insurance. How much is going to go to matches? And then you're going to have later in the year another batch coming up. You've got 13 buses and vans and combination of whatever we're doing. So probably half of that is committed, if not more, correct?
I think
The commitments are shown right above
And but the problem,
in dark.
The problem lies in is when the general public looks at this document, they're looking at that and thinking, boy, they've got $2.3 million just to blow.
Yeah.
That is the problem. We need to show what in there is encumbered, whether you do it in a highlighted, but there needs to be a number, because the wrong people are gonna get the idea that we've got a lot of money.
Well, there's going to be a number there. There's going to be a big number there. We just need to meet with Paul and decide how big the number
Yeah,
can be.
because
Safely.
whatever that number
Because
is.
we want Jill to feel like it's safe.
Yeah,
Yeah, well,
well,
right, I don't
if-
know, the public we're worried about, I can't even figure it out, so.
Yeah, because
let's
if-
dumb it down for my level.
If $600,000 of that $2.2 million, or what, 2.279, if $600,000 of that is committed to matches on grants for buses, then that automatically should be stricken. That should be 1.6 million, and it should show it up here that this is committed money for the buses. That should be transferred to the bus reserve. If 300,000 of it is for insurance, that should be banned, highlighted, this is for insurance, and taken out of that. That's not money we can use, that's money that's committed. And somehow, it has to, because I went through this over the weekend, and I just tore it up, to tell you the truth. Because I see lots of places we're spending money, and I want to know why and what it's for, and stuff, but it shows, it's misleading.
Hey, Paul, not to, I think this is great. Maybe we should start walking through the actual numbers. Because I think maybe if we understood the budget, we would understand the slideshow better.
Well, I'll tell you what, I could go through this, and this is really just to show you the format. It wasn't, we weren't really, I wasn't intending to go into individual numbers here. But then I was thinking we could dig into the numbers.
So you're gonna finish and we're gonna listen and then we're gonna go through the budget?
Yeah, I think that would be a good process.
Is that okay with you, Mr. Chairman? Sorry.
So,
It's fine with me, Madam Jill.
So this was the underlying philosophy. Here was the first section, that beginning reserves. The second section, which was budgeting operating revenues. And then part connected to these budgeted operating revenues was a breakout of all the different revenue sources for capital and operating contracting services to show what our match amounts were and what what revenue we'd be getting from various sources. And then this graph is just showing how our budget operating revenues break out. And you can see sales tax about 68% there. We have some assumptions underlying the budget, the budgeted revenue, and as we were saying before, that they're rather conservative. We said about 3% increase in sales tax revenue. We've already, with contracts we have in hand, we have a 25% increase in our contracted services, which includes the Tri-County Connector, paratransit, and rural mobility. There's no change to our van pool income, no significant changes, a few dollars, but no significant change in this budget. Fare income is left out of the budget, and 412 contracted service was left out of the budget because it hasn't been approved yet. We have a large section here, our budgeted operating expenses, which we'll examine more in detail. And you can see the way it's laid out right now, about 73% of that is wages and benefits, and fuel, of course, is a large expense as well, 10%. So just to give you an idea of the significance of where the money's being spent. Notable budgeted wage expense detail. This budget showing about 6% change to wages, and it's difference between the 2015 actual projected and the 2016 budget. It accounts for step increases, 1.5 added positions, contingency for board budget decision making, and it also includes unused operator hours. So it's not only necessarily an increase, but also a difference between what was used this year and what's projected for next year, what's budgeted for next year. One note about that I think makes reading this budget simpler is that sick leave, holiday, and vacation are estimated on an accrual basis. So what I did is I went out and figured out, in a worst case scenario, this is what, if everyone took their vacation and et cetera, this is what it would cost. But that isn't what necessarily happens in reality, which is our system figures it on a cash basis. So people, for example, could take less vacation than they were allowed. And therefore, the difference between the two would be greater. So because of that, it's better, I think, to look, first of all, to understand that, and to look at wages and benefits together if you're doing a side-by-side comparison. Because, for example, you could see like a 30 or 40% difference between actual and what is accrued and possible. So it's, I think we just need to keep that in mind when we're looking at the figures.
This also includes the Tri-County Connector contract service continuing throughout the year.
That's right.
Yeah.
Question here, Paul, on the, let's say, for example, vacation. Employees required to use their vacation or their sick leave in the same year? Or can they carry it forward for 3, 4, 5, 10 years?
They can carry it forward, but they're limited to 240 hours of sick leave? Vacation, 240 vacation hours. And
why, a lot of organizations say use those yeah, okay.
We're going to move on.
Move on.
Medical insurance premiums, we have increased by 6%, and our PERS rates are up 21.5%.
That's the big, one of the big jumps, because it's not only 21%, but it's on a big number.
Notable budgeted non-wage expense detail. We have small tools, net $94,000 change. A big portion of that we were estimating in this budget at about $83,500, which was upgrading an aging 5-year-old disk and storage system, which would double the size of our capacity. And
I'm going to have significant questions on this, just because of the age of the building and the fact that we're looking at some of these things and I'm not understanding, nor why we're not taking advantage of the cloud. So I just want to give you heads up that this is one that is going to require some extensive persuading on my end.
And I will say that we've gotten some estimates which are lower than even this figure, which will end up in our next edition of the budget. So it's a changing number, which is at least $10,000 less than that.
I should say, Sean, get ready, I'm going to have some questions.
We have contracted professional services.
Just one question. The current disk storage system must have been moved from the old building because it's 5 years old.
It was. It's
5 years old. That's the main reason that it needs to be updated. It's beginning to have maintenance failures.
That's right.
And 1 or 2 failures can be extremely expensive.
I think my issue is that I haven't heard the expression disk for about 15 years. So if we're going to upgrade, let's upgrade to technology that is used, because maybe it's something I'm not understanding, but I don't know any organization that's doing disk backup.
Mainframe computers, probably 50% of them across the country are using disk. This is a hybrid system that includes what's the flash memory, is what it would be on a PC, plus disk. It's, I think, considered completely up to date, but that's up to your people to say.
All I can say from my discussions with IT is that it's state-of-the-art, with some exception, is that if we wanted to go completely state-of-the-art, it would be more expensive. So this is a hybrid between conventional disk and solid state. Second item is contracted professional services, net $60,000 change. We have an executive search firm budgeted at $25,000, administrative personnel, compensation and policy review services $30,000, outside labor legal, 40,000, and of course it's a net, and one significant is reduced audit and accounting, negative about 17,000. Contract repair and maintenance, net
Hang
6.
on that one.
Yes.
On the reduced audit and accounting on that, this is state audit?
Yeah, we're anticipating not having to do a single audit this year, and then also, instead of hiring out an outside CPA to prepare our audit documents, I just did it myself, so.
Doesn't the state charges for their
They
audit?
do. We had almost $50,000 in expenditures last year for a state audit, and this year we're anticipating about 40.
It's more of a standard audit versus the in-depth one that we would do.
That's good.
Yeah. Contract repair and maintenance, net $62,000 change. We're talking about repainting, rewiring, and other improvements at Harbor Station, about $50,000. In training, we're proposing a net $25,000 increase, which is dispersed across various departments. The next section that's part of this budget is budgeted capital revenues and transfers from capital reserves. So here you're seeing more detail about what we're planning to purchase, but this is the revenue side. This is the monies that will be coming from the various grantors, and a large degree is coming through the state. And then there's also the transfers from the reserves, which would basically would be bringing the money from that we've already reserved to help pay for any expenditures that we have.
On the previous slide, I'm going to ask some questions about how that little transfer station in Oak Harbor is, you can get $50,000 worth of improvements there.
And
I've got lots of questions on that as well.
Okay, so just so you know, I'll have some there.
again, just like those, the other estimates, after I issued this budget, we got more detailed estimates, and they're lower, so.
Yeah, because I know how to paint.
Well, you could build a whole new transfer station.
But
I could build a new transfer station.
But the electric is
This-
probably a major portion of that.
Let's
Okay.
The painting is a minor portion.
move along.
And this is how it shows graphically in terms of capital revenues, the monies that we'd be getting to pay for those items. You can see a large portion of that, 58% is for buses. And of course, the next section in this budget was budgeted capital expenditures and transfers to capital reserves. So this would be monies flowing out of this budget into reserves, or money spent for those capital expenditures. That's just the other side of the coin. We'd spend the money for capital items, and before we saw that the money would come back to help pay for those. And you can see again, in terms of expenses or buses, again, 54% of the capital expenses. The only difference between this graph and the previous graph is, of course, the bond. We continue to pay off our capital bond, about $320,000.
When's that bond expected to be done?
January of 19.
5-year bond.
Budgeted capital purchases and bonds. Again, this is just stated more simply. 13 light buses, $1.5 million. 12 van pool vans, $330,000. Parker Road revision, about $275,000. A bike rack for Parker Road, about $11,000. 2 heavy engine rebuilds, $45,000. Mobile data software and hardware, $350,000, and then our bond principal and interest.
It's the Parker Road items are, in a sense, a pass-through because they're coming from grants.
The Parker, yeah, these are all grants, except for, of course, the bond principal and interest, but we're paying off items that we received grants on in the past. That's why it's categorized there. But the Parker Road revision is 100% reimbursement, so that is truly pass-through.
And the others are 100%
Matches, and we'll go through that in a little bit, but you can see the schedule. And then here's the last section of budget ending reserves. So that's the result of what would end up in our reserves as we, after all the activity happens. So you can see we're already budgeting for for bus, van, and support vehicle reserves in 2015, and that's going to change in 2016 as well. Oops. Got one more slide there. Here's a graph that shows us our commitment to create reserves, and you can see in 14 we just had that operating reserve, and then in 15 we're showing that we're slowly starting to build these other reserves. We have the support, van, and bus reserves, and then in 2016 you can see the bus reserve has expanded considerably. So that gives you an idea of what's happening, both in the more micro level, each reserve, and then in total.
On your color coding, Paul, dark blue represents
Bus.
bus. Okay, I see it better now. Your glasses, your lights.
It's hard to see.
Does that help?
Make it worse.
Makes it worse.
Yeah, glare. Yeah.
And that's it. So if you'd like, we could move on to the details in the budget itself.
I think we should, I take a pass through it at least.
Just take a
together.
quick pass, okay?
And then if there's big questions, maybe, if that's what the chair wants to do.
Yeah, I don't mind going through it. I look at the percentages, and a lot of the percentage increases on these things are because they're small amounts
That's right.
relative to the total budget, and by adding a little bit more or adding something in there, which is still a small amount relative to the overall budget, it gives a higher percentage number in there, substantially higher
That's right.
percentage.
So if we look at just the first page as a summary, this is a form of a resolution. It just looks at the really high level that we have a beginning reserves and operating reserve. We have our inflows and outflows for both operating and capital. And the difference, this is an assumption, would go into that operating reserve because there's money left over unaccounted for and not restricted or designated anyway. So just a really high level picture. Gives you an overall understanding of what's happening. In this case, it's a positive. We have a surplus.
If we add a restricted reserve, it would come out of the ending general operating reserve and appear as a transfer to capital reserves, right?
Yes.
It would kick back up a couple of lines. And then the ending operating reserve would be could be significantly smaller.
And here I have it labeled with a 0 in it, but transfer to contingency operating reserve. That could stay restricted operating reserve as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay, I have a question for Ken, for you, and for Sean, and I thought maybe Ken Riley would be involved in this conversation too. We have an obligation now for the grant funds to replace a bunch of vehicles. Is it absolutely imperative that there are vehicles being replaced that could still last in this fleet for another year safely without major, I'm talking about major repairs, not just normal repairs. Even a new vehicle has maintenance costs. And the reason I ask that question is, if we are obligated this year to take, let's say, bus number 100, let's say it's your medium-sized bus. If we don't use that bus, we take it and we don't use that bus, effectively mothballing it for 1 year or 2 years and continue to use the existing rolling stock that you have that can safely be used. Then in the following sequence of vehicle replacement, we use the vehicle that we purchased on this year's grant or next year's grant. The reason for that is we always have a match attached to all of these. And I sometimes think that because of an age, an artificial age of a standard vehicle, standard mileage says we have to get rid of it. Is that always the criteria? We have to get rid of it because those accounting numbers line up versus the utility value of that vehicle.
So I'll just say, I think we have ran a lot of those vehicles that are identified for replacement well beyond their useful life. And we've just, the maintenance has done a good job maintaining those vehicles. And, you know, given the financial trouble we ran into, we weren't able to do anything. So, and I think just with that being said, a lot of them that are identified should be replaced. And I wish Ken was here, he could, you know, speak more mechanically to that.
If I might, when we originally did the resolution to go ahead and apply for these grants, Ken was here. These vehicles were vetted thoroughly. They far exceeded their mileage expectations and far exceeded their age expectations. And he reiterated over and over again, and I'm sure the minutes would show this, that those vehicles would not be, that it costs more to maintain them than it does to replace them, as well as he doesn't feel that they're safe to put on the road. We vetted these out thoroughly when we discussed it 6 months ago. Yes.
The other thing is that Paul can probably talk to this better. The grant period is done in 2-year increments, so it wouldn't be a matter of just 1 year. We'd have to wait for the next grant cycle, apply, and then it would take some more time, so we'd have to look at that too.
Okay.
Well, and the other thing is when we're talking about a recovery and stability plan for the future of this organization, as far as the stability, having in my mind, having a reliable and less costly to maintain fleet of vehicles. And I understand you're looking at numbers and do we actually need these buses now? But that's the core. Without the vehicles, we might as well close the doors. We can't put people on unsafe vehicles just simply because of a liability issue. But when it costs more to maintain them, they've far exceeded the recommended schedule.
They sometimes exceed their recommended lifetime by 2, 3, 4 years, and their mileage is quite a bit higher than we recommended.
Rick, I might also add to Robin's comments that the 2-year cycle is related to the 2-year budget and legislative cycle in Olympia, and going to a new cycle. As an example, hypothetically, if we didn't take any of the funds that were approved for us for this cycle, we would have to start over in the next cycle, and there's no guarantee that we would be approved in the next cycle. So there's a great risk involved in terms of where we would fall that next cycle with the rest of the state. It's I won't say competitive, but it's based on need at the state level, and the funds are allocated accordingly. Also regarding replacement, it's more important to honor the replacement schedule of smaller vehicles than it is necessarily for the bigger vehicles like the 35 and 40-foot vehicles, which in the long run can be cycled longer at a safe level and a mechanically reliable level, because proportionally they are, I won't say, I'm saying cheaper, but that isn't the proper term, I guess, but in terms of the costs involved in maintaining those vehicles over a longer period, it is cheaper for larger vehicles than it is for smaller vehicles. As an example, the vehicles that are recommended for 5 or 7 year replacement, proportionally it's more expensive to keep those buses going than it is a larger vehicle where we can fairly economically now in-house rebuild engines versus replacing an entire engine. Whereas on the smaller vehicles, a rebuild isn't practical, we have to go out and buy a new engine. So there are things that we can replace cheaper on a larger vehicle than there are on a smaller vehicle. So it's more economical. And the smaller vehicles are the ones being replaced, not the larger ones. We're rebuilding and trying to keep those going a number of years more than we are the smaller vehicles, which are more susceptible to earlier fatigue.
Okay, thank you. And I think this board has an obligation to have the more than just have a conversation, but through the conversation, go through and vet all of the opportunities to cut down on mileage, which cuts down on operational costs and increases the life of the vehicle. And for example, would it be practical to go from the 20-passenger paratransit vehicle down to a more of a van style? And should we be looking at contracting that out? That's just one concept. Number two, should we look at, if we keep the van, the paratransit, whether it's the 20-passenger, they're 20 passengers, aren't they, Sean?
So there's a couple different kinds. You got your mid-sized buses
Yeah.
that do deviated paratransit, fixed and paratransit, that are the 20
Yeah.
some odd passengers.
Yeah, the smaller ones, but the point is, would we be better to have paratransit parked in a concept the way we park the van pool, like at a station in the location that they primarily work, rather than this long distance travel. And I see this often on the road. Vehicles coming from the south end up here, vehicles coming from the north end down here, and going back and forth. Shouldn't we be hubbing these things, or excuse me, not hubbing them always right here, but to have satellite hubs for these? And the employees who work in the north end, if they're doing paratransit, then they have the vehicle there. We can have a contract with a fuel provider. We know the vehicles have to come back here for maintenance eventually, but on a weekly basis, shouldn't they be parked in that area where you have satellite hubs, whether we're parking them, let's say we work with the city of Oak Harbor, for example, or we work with the county if they have stations, or you park them where you park the van pool by permission with the property owner. There's a lot of miles going in between with no ridership in it. And I don't think I'm very far off on that there's a lot of extra miles being put to this that's unnecessary. But that affects our bottom line on our operational costs and no revenue.
So just some of the things to consider on that one would be, are the operators going to those locations to check in for their shifts? Or are they still coming here because we're required for fit for duty checks when the operators show up, and then driving deadheading with the smaller vehicles out to those locations? So you're still going to have some element of the deadheading, but I see definitely ways to cut back on that.
Well, and thanks for that input, because I didn't think about that. I don't know about that. They're checking in for duty. But let's say, for example, this is just an example. They check. You have your satellite hub is with the city of Oak Harbor. You have a secured gate. You go in. You check in with the staff, and you get in your vehicle. You go. You still have a government agency there. Are they going to accept that responsibility? I don't know. Is it going to really be any different than coming in here and checking in with somebody? You don't do breathalyzer tests, you don't do blood tests when you check in, you're doing a visual.
Yeah, but we're responsible for those operators when they go on the road as far as fit for duty, and them having a commercial driver's license, they have to meet certain standards.
Right.
You're right, we don't sit here and do a breathalyzer, but if I thought that someone was coming in and they had an issue or was under the influence of something, then I would have that ability to send them in for testing. For
So every
suspicion.
driver checks in with you?
Every driver checks in with our dispatch, which all the dispatchers have been trained by our EAP on reasonable suspicion and fit for duty. Well, not reasonable for suspicion, that's the supervisor.
Yeah.
Fit for duty as far as the dispatchers when they sign in at the window.
And you don't think that the, let's say the South Whidbey School District dispatcher for their facility is not capable of doing that or being trained to do that?
Yeah, so I don't know, I really can't speak to that because I don't know what the regulations would be regarding them certifying, our operators.
But we're looking for ways, at least I'm looking for ways to get to yes, to make the operational costs cheaper and still provide the service.
I understand.
Not to be a wet blanket on you, and I understand your concern with it, and I think it's part of it is just the logistics of where we're at. We're on Highway 20, and every bus is going to come up and down Highway 20 whether they're coming in on or off for duty. But if you start looking at parking at other facilities, you're going to have interlocal agreements. If you've got other people doing checks, you're going to have some sort of contract in place with that agency. Now you're talking about contracting with the City of Oak Harbor, and then you've got to have a contract, you're talking about maybe with the school. You're looking at security for the buses.
We do interlocal agreements all the time.
I realize that, but you have to, there's somewhere in there that whoever you're doing the interlocal agreement with, there's going to be a WIFO, and that's what's in it for me. The other thing is we're still in the process of talking about putting in fares, and if there's fares included, the buses have to come back to headquarters to get the fare boxes removed. So all these things are things that we need to look at.
Yeah.
So
Fuel,
if we're parking them helter-skelter, then they're not getting their fares collected.
And I'm sorry, Rick, if I can interject. It's not a major issue at this point, but occasionally, even with cameras in place at certain park and ride facilities where we do have van pools parked, we do occasionally have vandalism.
I've wondered about that often.
Even with cameras.
Yeah, because I see them parked around, and I wonder if we ever get break-ins.
Occasionally a battery missing or attempts to steal fuel.
Especially ones by Safeway that park up in there because they're kind of off to the side.
Well, actually, I think South County.
Is it South End better?
Is worse, yes. But I did want to make a point, Rick, for future consideration for the board. Your comments about size differences on vehicles and fleet composition is a point well taken. And I think that is an issue that needs to be probably looked at a little more closely by the board in the planning and TDP process for future years, so that those decisions can be made ahead of time before grants are applied for, before TDP is updated, and that those discussions are held early on before those planning issues are more solidified, so that those considerations are taken into account when we do get to budget considerations or planning for upcoming years. So for example, now would be the time to be talking about smaller vehicles for our next TDP update, for example.
But the TDP update is a 6-year plan though, isn't it?
Right, but each year it's reviewed.
Reviewed, yeah.
And updated each year. So that is a big consideration if the board wants to, and should, look at the different size vehicles for future purposes. That's the ideal time to get into that discussion.
Is it excuse me, I want to ask you one question on that. Is it a fact that the vans, like the large vans for the van pool, are they cheaper to purchase than the smaller of the two types of
Yes.
for paratransit?
Yeah.
Okay. And they're probably cheaper to operate. Would that be a fact?
That's correct.
Wait.
The problem is that, so you'd have to outfit those with the lifts and all that stuff. And what I've heard just from a few passengers. We haven't looked into it that deeply, but, you know, as far as their mobility moving around inside of those buses, for the people that are ambulatory, that can cause a problem. They can't, you know, you can't really stand up all the way in those vehicles like you can in a bus with the grab rails and things like that. So that'd be something else we would, you know, have to look at.
Okay, thanks. Lance, you had a question here.
Well, I did, but it was covered.
Okay, thanks. Well, I think we have an obligation, and I think, I'm certainly not criticizing this board, but I think we have to ask questions all the way down the line and dig deep in this, because the recovery details are always deeply found in the system, because it's a culture that it's so, I'm not saying just this kind of transit, but often it gets to, well, that's the way we've done it before, that's the way we're comparing it to last year, and we don't look for, pardon the term, but out-of-the-box thinking with more creative ways of improving our operation.
I just feel like one thing I need to say is the board has put out its desires to operate as efficiently as possible. The timelines of when these conversations come to us shouldn't necessarily be board-driven. We're not watching the internal operations in terms of when these grants come around and when we're going to do a TDP and when we're going to need to make these decisions. So I feel like we've given directions in terms of priorities, be creative, keep costs down, let's try to be smarter, more efficient, look for new ways of doing things. That's the direction we've given. The timelines aren't continually for us to keep generating these conversations. That there needs to be some ownership by everyone that says the board is looking for more efficient ways. We've got some of these brainstorms. We know we have to have a decision from them before a TDP. Let's start that conversation 3 months out or 4 months out. But that is not our responsibility to know when those conversations start. And I just, you know, I want to be really clear about that. That this is the first time, except for Jim, the first time any of this board has been through this conversation, so we're learning things as we go and we're throwing out different ideas as we hear them. But it shouldn't all the things should not be identified by this board. The fact that we need to update the policy manual should have been a conversation that came to us, not one that we identified and said, what's going on with the policy manual? So I just want to get that turned around as soon as we can. Because we've been together a year now, our personalities are pretty well known. Let's get ahead of these things, and so we're not continually reacting.
Just for clarification, Jill, the majority, if not all, of the grant decisions that were made that are being included in this particular budget had already been made for the 2015-2017 budget cycle. So we've inherited basically all of the capital items that you see at the present time.
Yeah, and that's fine. What I heard is some language in there that made it seem like if the board wants to have these conversations, and some of what I'm trying to turn around is to get people to bring needs and conversations to us so that we're not, as an organization, always reacting to the ideas we're coming up with, but that we're getting ideas presented to us in a way that makes sense structurally, and the timing makes sense, and that we're able to make incremental decisions that get us where we want to go. Because right now, we're learning things and then talking about them, and learning something and then talking about it. And we're maybe moving a little more sideways than straight towards our goal. And I just think it's a procedural thing. So that's my opinion, is that maybe we should be taking a little more ownership and bringing some stuff forward to us.
It would be nice, I think, at our board meetings if we would set some time aside, maybe not every meeting, but at some meetings, for just discussion. Whether it's from Sean, he's got some ideas, whether it's from Ken, he's got some ideas, or this is what some other transit companies are doing, and just to, you know, not make any decision necessarily, but hear about what's happening out there and some new ideas. And we're looking into this, we don't know if it will work, but this is what we're doing. I would appreciate that kind of discussion on a regular basis if we could.
I think it's very difficult for the board, as was mentioned earlier that you come from different areas representing your constituents in those areas. And it's difficult when you start to get a better understanding